Ambassador Kelley Currie, the founding partner of Kilo Alpha Strategies, a boutique geopolitical advisory firm. She's currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council with a joint affiliation at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and the Freedom and Prosperity Center. She serves on the boards of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy, the Board of Governors of the East-West Center, and the advisory boards of Spirit of America, the Vandenberg Coalition, and the Global Taiwan Institute. Ambassador Currie was unanimously confirmed in July 2017 as the U.S. representative to the UN Economic and Social Council, an alternative representative to the UN General Assembly under Ambassador Nikki Haley. Many of you may not know this, but we actually have 2 ambassadors at the UN, not just one. She was subsequently appointed interim senior official at the Department of State's Office of Global Criminal Justice, that's the old War Crimes Office, and confirmed as Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues and the U.S. representative at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Currie. And to her right, Dr. George Bogden. Dr. Bogden is a George F. Kennan Fellow at the Kennan Institute. He is also a Strategy and Policy Fellow funded by the Smith Richardson Foundation and a senior visiting researcher at Bard College. Previously, he served as the German Marshall Fund's Helmut Schmidt Fellow based in Berlin. Before completing his graduate education, he served as the inaugural senior fellow at the Hungry Foundation in residence in Budapest, as well as the first associate director of the Center for the Future of Liberal Society at the Hudson Institute, and I believe he's also working on a book. Is that correct? Okay, Doctor. Wonderful. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bogden to the panel. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to have you both with us. This panel is titled, Why Isolationism is the Wrong Strategy for These Perilous Times. So it may sound like we're not going to have a debate on the merits of isolationism, but we are going to have a debate. So isolationism, as Secretary Pompeo said, has been a strain in our foreign policy for many, many years. I'll just offer a couple quotes to start the panel. George Washington's farewell address, quote, "The great rule of conduct for us in regards to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible." John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, speech to the House, July 4th, 1821. America, quote, "goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." But there's another quote there that is rarely quoted, but I think equally interesting. He says, "She," meaning America, "has, in the lapse of nearly half a century, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations, while asserting and maintaining her own. She has abstained from interference in the concerns of others, even when conflict has been for principles to which she clings, as to the last vital drop that visits the heart." A nice quote there from our former Secretary of State and our former President. So, Ambassador Currie, maybe I will start with you. Are we dipping towards isolationism in American foreign policy? I mean, you look at what Secretary Pompeo laid out. Hands off, out of Afghanistan, let's negotiate with the Russians, let's negotiate with the Iranians, let's negotiate with Communist China. Is isolationism actually the core thrust of American foreign policy today?
Well, first of all, I have to thank our host here at the Steamboat Institute for bringing us together for this really important conversation and really reflecting on what my former boss, Secretary Pompeo, said this morning. I think that this idea, this framing between some sort of globalism or neoliberalism where the United States is going out and this kind of Wilsonian impulse to go out and fix every problem in the world and a kind of John Birch isolationist impulse that's always been there. Both of these things are threads that have run through America's foreign policy history, and they ebb and flow. And this is we are, I think, in a cycle of focusing more on our own interests and needs. But I think that the problem with that is that the world, we may be done with dealing with these problems, but they're not done with us. And I think that It is a challenge. When we talk about our power and our responsibility, and we haven't always used that power responsibly or well. And it has caused us problems both abroad and at home because we have not always acted the way that we should, and that we haven't acted when we could at times also. We don't always get it right. In fact, we get it wrong quite a bit because foreign policy is made by human beings who are fallible, and by the time a decision point reaches the Secretary of State or the President, it's not like you have some awesome option over here and some really terrible option over here that you get to choose and it's obvious which one is the right thing to do. You're usually dealing with two terrible options and you have to choose the least bad one. And how you make those decisions depends a lot on your priors, whether it's your prior experience with a similar situation or your prior values and your principles that you hold dear to as a leader or as a decision maker. And so I think that we do now have a generation of leaders who are shaped by a reluctance to use American power in certain ways, and a confusion, in a sense, about what it is that we should be doing, because for the past, especially since the end of the Cold War, we still have not really sorted out as a nation what it is that we want our role to be in the world. And so I think that sometimes we're in a little bit of epistemological confusion about what it is that we want to be doing in the world. I think sometimes, we have this huge military that is very capable, but also is very vulnerable to being misused and misapplied to certain situations. And we've underinvested in other aspects. We've made ourselves vulnerable, as the previous panel discussed, to asymmetrical competition that we have not that we haven't prepared to deal with. And so I think that there was I was telling Mary yesterday, there was a really good piece by Peggy Noonan yesterday in the Wall Street Journal where she talks about average Americans feeling like they're being invaded by an ideology they cannot name. And I think that, when I say that really, and when I read that, it really resonated with me, because I think we do feel that way, like we are being invaded by something we can't name. And it's not something that our military can stop. It's not something that our powerful economy can stop. It's something that only we can stop, the invasion in our own minds and in our own souls about what it is that we want our country to be. But we're so confused about that because our elites are also confused and they don't know what it is that they actually want our country to be. And so this is, I think it's actually deeper than isolationism. I think it's this crisis of not just confidence, but also a crisis of competence in our elite institutions. And this has made us unsure of what we should be doing both at home and abroad.
Well, it's just such a fantastic place to start. And really, George, it seems a crisis of identity. And I wonder if it goes back to the end of the Cold War when President Clinton said, well, do we really need this powerful military anymore? We're in a unipolar moment. So maybe we can focus on other things and global trade and international organizations, this kind of fantasy land. Is that why we have this confusion? And my gosh, haven't we woken up? Why has it taken us so long to wake up to these threats that our panelists and speakers today have spoken of?
Mary, thank you so much. I think you're absolutely right to frame this as a debate. And before I go on, I'll just say that it's a tremendous honor to be here at Steamboat, but also to be on stage with the ambassador. And I think she articulated many important issues. When you mentioned the founders, I think they were having a debate as well. John Adams, the father of John Quincy, talked about the United States as not having a choice, that we are a, quote, dangerous nation, end quote, that people look at us as a kind of seat of democracy that is always going to inherently undermine forces around the world that seek to quell liberty. And so I wonder the extent to which we can actually choose to be truly isolationist, to be truly inward-looking. And I think this is even reflected in our Constitution. You would be surprised, I think, to find out that our first minister to Britain was also our first Chief Justice. And the reason that our Constitution was written so that people in the judiciary can hold appointments from the executive branch of the United States and people from Congress cannot, I think was reflective of the fact that different parts of our government were going to play roles internationally than we might not immediately expect. I think more than a crisis of identity, we're dealing with a crisis of ideas. And I want to put out there that I think there's been a unwillingness on the part of America's foreign policy elites to think about the compromise that they're asking the American people to make. It, I think, comes naturally to everyday people on the street that in order to have a safe home, you have to have a safe neighborhood. But they might object to the idea that they have to spend money on a blighted neighborhood 2 towns away that they've never visited in order to have a safe home. And so you have to, I think, articulate arguments that make sense to people who are otherwise feeling the pressures of economic, interest rates rising and inflation rising, so on and so forth, and that we have had these ideas that separated by 2 oceans and kind of situated among Pacific nations, we can enjoy, a kind of reclusiveness. And so what I would say is that the predominant narrative, going back to that moment that you mentioned, the end of the Cold War, has been something that I grew up hearing all the time, that the United States, by engaging internationally, creates what's called a peace dividend. Okay? And that's a well-meaning, noble idea, right? That the United States gets to enjoy all sorts of benefits from ensuring peace in the world. I would say that right now, what people want is a realism rebate. And
Great phrase.
What I mean by that is
like
that
that.
people want the United States to have a laser-like focus on what we really should be investing in, and we want our allies to pay their fair share. And I'll stop there, but I want to elaborate those points a bit further in the future of this conversation, because I think that people are willing to support Israel. They're willing to support Ukraine, but they want to know that in 5 years, foolish policies are not going to recrudesce the same problem yet again and hurt them in their pocketbook.
But a lot of that comes back to leadership, and as you say, George, making the case. And I think part of the issue that we face today is that the administration isn't making the case, isn't explaining what George has laid out, nor are they explaining the threat here at home that Secretary Pompeo just spoke to us about. Ambassador Currie, how significant is that threat? Why is it so hard, not just for this administration, but also for conservative leaders to make that case? What has gone on in our politics that has made that change?
Well, I mean, we could spend a whole seminar talking about, the polarization in the United States, the atomization of media and popular culture, and all of those things that cause us to all kind of be in our own little media bubbles where we only hear from people that we want to hear from, who validate our priors and never question our assumptions. And I think that as conservatives working in policy, we do benefit from living in an ecosystem where our priors are challenged all the time, whereas our current leadership, nobody around them ever really challenges their priors, and so they don't feel the need to explain themselves to people because they only ever talk to people who agree with them. And I think that this is
So
a
at least
problem.
we're having a debate
Yes.
on the conservative side of politics.
Well, it's not even so much that we're having a debate on the conservative side of politics, but we are constantly having to defend and explain our positions in ways that people on the other side do not. The media just assumes that they all are well-intentioned and are trying to do the right thing, and we don't get that benefit of the doubt. I can tell you from working in the U.S. government, that never happened to me. And so I think that that's a big part of it. But I think that where it is astonishing to me that when I see charts about, for instance, immigration at the southern border, that all of the increase since the beginning of the Biden administration is from countries other than Mexico and the Northern Triangle. If it were not for those, for the big category of other, we would be level set on immigration from the Trump years and from the lowest ebb of the Trump years. But because people are coming from, we had last year 43,000 migrants from Russia. We had 42,000 from India and 24,000 from China who presented themselves at the southern border. That's up from 4,100, 2,600, and 450 respectively, in 2021. Those are astonishing statistics that people are coming up through our southern border from those places. And it is just shocking to me that the Biden administration is not talking about that or doesn't see that as a problem because of domestic politics. I think that we've got to find ways that don't sound nativist and racist, because that turns people off too, to actually deal with these problems and talk about them in ways that, I mean, everybody in this room and everybody, I think, normal person in America understands the problem here. But our elites don't want to talk about it on the left in a way that is realistic, and unfortunately a lot of our political leaders on the right talk about it in a way that is borderline offensive, because it's almost racist in the way that they talk about it, or in some cases flat out racist, and doesn't address the problem that was mentioned in the previous panel, that we actually do need a certain level of legal immigration into this country, because we are, that's the nature of our economy and the nature of our country. But the bigger problem is that we can't fix the legal immigration system either. And they're just talking past each other most of the time.
Well, we're going to talk a lot about immigration in the panel with Julio Rosas,
sorry.
so I don't want to step on his topics, but it is, I think, a common thread here that we're discovering today, of the interconnectedness, whether it's our supply chains, whether it's our ability to project power, given our bases around the world and the cooperation with allies, that we can't talk about these things in isolation, because that's actually not how the world works. So George, I want to go to you, and thank you, by the way, to the audience for all of your excellent questions. Can we not be focused on America first, however, without being labeled isolationist?
Well, I think that oftentimes in the debate around foreign policy, you have phrases that have tremendous baggage attached to them. And so when I hear the conversation about America first, or as the Secretary said this morning, Bangladesh first, so on and so forth, I think we have to recognize that there's a desire by those who are cognizant of the 20th century to make big clunky analogies to periods like the 1920s and so on and so forth. I personally don't think those are so helpful. I think, again, the Secretary in Never Give an Inch really articulates clearly the task in thinking about these issues. And he said you have to refuse to affirm a consensus that does not exist, and more importantly, that the American people do not think would be good for America in their minds if it did exist, right? And so you have to constantly question commitments that have been carried over, that are written into policy, that seem to not be functioning right now. And that's how I think you can avoid the label of isolationism, the kind of brute force suggestion that the administration now or in the future is kind of failing on its commitments. I think every administration comes in and makes decisions. The Biden administration, for example, immediately stepped out of the Geneva Consensus Agreement that the previous administration had signed. And I didn't hear, the op-ed pages of our major papers saying, "Oh my goodness, what an isolationist power the United States has become." So that's kind of my view on the label issue. But I do think that it's going to be a roadblock as we continue to talk about foreign policy and national security.
Well, if the audience accepts the premise that we do need allies and friends and partners for important aspects of our security, be they military or supply chains, or as Julio will talk about, for securing our southern border. Kelley, you worked in the guts of the United Nations. You've worked with many, many, many countries of all different stripes. Who can we rely on? How easy or difficult is it to get cooperation on these critical issues that experts like Elaine, for instance, have outlined this morning?
Well, I think that, first of all, we've got to get back to this place where our enemies fear us and our allies know that we have their back. And we are not there right now on either count. And so that's a huge problem. It's very hard to get people to cooperate with you when you think that when they believe that you're not going to be there when they need you. That's a huge problem. And so I think that one of the things that we did under Ambassador Haley's leadership at the UN was we made sure that our friends in the UN and in our alliance circles knew that if they had our back, we would have their back.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, Ukraine was a great example of this. Ukraine was one of our best supporters at the United Nations. Whenever we needed a vote on a critical issue, they were always there for us, and they wanted to be helpful. And then when they needed us in the Security Council, we were there, and we would sponsor and support resolutions criticizing Russia's invasion of Crimea, and we were there for them when they needed us. And even during, it was not easy during the Trump administration to make Ukraine one of our closest allies with everything that was going on, but we were able to do that because they knew that we would have their back when they needed us in the UN. And Israel was another example. It was not easy to be the only country that would stand up in the UN and fight for Israel inside the Security Council, even when some of our closest allies were wobbly or would,
Such as?
Yes, even the UK, the French, some of our best friends would be like, yes, we support Israel, but, and we were like, yeah, there's no but here. We just have to do it. They're isolated and they are alone in the UN, and we have to stand with them. And so that was, and as a consequence, Israel was always there for us when we needed them. And so I think that we have to look at, this idea that we need to be seen as, no better friend, no worse enemy. That's got to be at the core of how we think about and construct our foreign policy and our engagement with other countries. That they know that we will be there when we need them, if they are there for us, and that if they attack us, that it will be the end of them. That's got to be part of it too. It's not a either or. It's got to be a both and.
Well, I mean, that's a bit more of a nuanced argument than pay more in NATO.
Yeah. Well, but pay more in NATO is part of it too.
And it's important.
Because they've got to show us that they're going to be there. And I think if you look at Ukraine, at the Ukraine situation, Europe has stepped up. And you have a number of European countries that are spending a higher percentage of their GDP on weapons and support to Ukraine than the United States. In fact, Europe as a whole is doing that. And that doesn't get a lot of attention. And I mean, Secretary Pompeo this morning had it just right. Like, we should send them all this stuff and we should take the handcuffs off and not, restrict them from using it, because we're just prolonging a stalemate. Biden's policy on Ukraine, for instance, right now is not to win, it's just to not lose. And that can't be how we do things. Our allies and our partners have to know that we're in it to win it, that we want them to win and not just not lose. And so I think the other thing is we do need allies. We're on a planet with billions of other people, most of whom want what we have. They want freedom, prosperity, safety. They want to be able to live in a country that is well governed and peaceful and where they're able to have opportunities. But there are some countries out there that they want to destroy what we have. And we need friends. We can't go it alone. America first doesn't have to mean America alone. We said that all the time when we worked at the State Department. That was one of our mantras, and it was something that we talked about when we met with our allies and friends and made sure that they understood that was how we approached this. But it is, when it comes to things like China, our challenge on China, we have some really terrible allies right now. Germany, France, some of our Gulf allies are not, even the UK, and some of our closest allies are not being good allies. But part of that is that they don't see a real consistency or clarity coming from our own administration, and so they're going to cut their own deals if they don't think that we're going to be consistent and we're going to be strong.
Well, I also think the prior administration didn't get enough credit for the kind of alliance-building measures that we did. We revivified the Quad. In fact, Europe came to us and said, let's start a dialogue on China. That was their idea. And there are many,
after significant pushing and dragging.
Some kicking under the table, but they eventually came to. But there are a lot of things that happened that didn't get that kind of attention, and that the current administration has expanded on. AUKUS, for instance, the Australia-UK-US agreement to build subs and other cooperation. But I think part of the reason I'm so excited about this panel is because of the insider view that you give us, Ambassador, about how the world really works with alliances and why isolationism is really not an option. But George, you've also spent an enormous amount of time in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, understanding how those nations think about American power. What did you learn about what they need or how they perceive our role? Do they want us out? Do they want an isolationist America and they feel capable of handling things on their own? Do they hate us? What did you learn?
Right. Well, I think that, just to return briefly to the concept of the realism rebate, let's assume the United States is undertaking intelligent foreign policy, making the right choices in the right places. I think in order to get that refund after, a little bit of waiting time, you have to have allies who are on the same page with you, who are linked arms in arm. And I want to talk a little bit about my experiences in Germany, but also in countries like Poland and Hungary, just to kind of give you what I think are the differences in views in that region. So first, just to start with Germany, I was there in the aftermath of what Chancellor Scholz was calling the Zeitenwende, which was this concept of a change in era. He said, after Germany invaded Ukraine, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Germany can never be the same, right? And we have to arm ourselves and make sure that we are doing our fair share in Europe's security. And that little Freudian slip that I had there, I think, was also in the minds of many Germans, because guess what? Germany did once invade Ukraine, and it has to live with the historical sense of guilt about that invasion, right? And so how do you balance this deep sense of pacifism with the needs of the moment? And I was one of the slightly optimistic people that thought maybe Germany is going to change its view. And I believed Chancellor Scholz when he said they were going to spend 100 billion euros. This is big money in Germany on rebuilding their defense. Now, just last November, maybe almost 2 years after the invasion, the New York Times, a newspaper that is quite sympathetic to Germany, even when it has a conservative government, has basically said there's been no change in the rank and file of Germany's military. Yeah. And I think this has to do with what I constantly heard when I would go to the Bundestag and engage and provide briefings. When you ask a typical German official, what are Germany's interests? They will say something like multilateralism. Yeah. And so you will see there, right, the deep unwillingness to think of Germany as having national interests. A president of Germany actually said about a decade ago that the reason Germany needs to police the lanes of sea trade is because it is an economic power. And he was forced to resign because of this. So the deep kind of psychodrama within its own sense of itself, while simultaneously being the wealthiest and most powerful, some would say, country in the EU, is very complicated. And so to have that second part of the equation, to get that rebate, you have to lead Germany along in a conversation about doing their fair share in a serious sense in hard power terms, and that's hard. Now let's talk about other countries like Hungary and Poland, right? I think any person that kind of has a sense of where our social democracy has gone in the last 15 years would be concerned about some steps that the Hungarian government has taken, right? We don't agree with all of our allies on everything. But in a moment like this, where just a couple hundred kilometers away there's an open war in Europe, now might be the time for more respect and restraint. And recognition that Hungary has actually rearmed itself in a very serious way that other countries in the region have not. Now, this doesn't erase disagreements, but it provides a basis for common ground that is more productive than what I have seen in terms of the United States' orientation with countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which is very brittle, which is somewhat partisan. And so that's what I think is really at play in a kind of more nuanced alliance management that deals with the pressing reality of the moment, that we have an open war in Europe that continues to simmer, and we're searching for an end to it that is going to avoid future relapses in which the American people have to pay even higher bills.
That reminded me of one of my strangest moments at the UN when you said that, George, because I remember we were in a meeting when we were discussing some issue of UN reform and the need to get the UN to do better on something. And we were, our point was that this needs to change, and we need to think about this and get this to work better as a better tool. That multilateralism is not, a means to an end. It is a tool of diplomacy, and it is a tool of national security. And one of my European colleagues said, "Oh, but Kelley, you have to understand, for us Europeans, multilateralism is a core value." And I'm like, I was so stunned. I was like, I don't even know what that means. I literally looked at it, I'm like, okay, we're gonna have to put that to the side because you're gonna have to explain that to me later, because I'm literally like, I don't even know what that means. Multilateralism is a core value. I'm like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And we're sitting in the UN, and I'm like, no, I'm sorry. Like, they prioritize, you're right, though, they prioritize, and you see it in the way the EU operates, that they prioritize this multilateralism as this, like, they've made it this iconic deification of multilateralism that is so, and this is, I think, when you see like the UK pulling out of the EU, it's because of stuff like this. And I was looking at my Eastern European colleagues, they're like, yeah, we're not part of this. This is like, okay, just gut check here. But I mean, like the Germans, the Dutch, they really believe this stuff. It's kind of like, okay, but multilateralism is not going to save you when bad things start to happen, just to be clear. This is not working. And so it's really insane what's going on in Europe right now. Well, worse than us, way worse than us.
Well, that's comforting. At least we're not the worst, we're second worst. There was a question from the audience about UN peacekeeping operations, which raises a broader issue of, even when we do have these multilateral institutions that could potentially take the burden off of us, do they work? I mean, does NATO work? Does the UN work? What was your experience, Ambassador?
I think that sometimes is the answer. I mean, I think that what we have seen is, for instance, in Africa, you've seen a lot greater burden sharing by the African countries themselves. The AU does.
African Union.
The African Union is predominantly responsible for peacekeeping in Africa now. And they do it without a lot of, the UN helps, and that's a lot of US training and a lot of support on the back end, logistics and supplies and things like that, and airlift. Intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance it's basically the intelligence aspects that we provide. But I think that we have basically outsourced a lot of things to, but those are primarily lower level conflicts that don't have huge international security implications for us. Where you see that it has failed massively, of course, is with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You saw this, and where it's failed massively is in Syria. And in other places, in Burma is another place that's just a festering, nasty civil war right in between India and China, where the UN has not been able to do anything helpful. And so you see that when Russia and China sitting on the Security Council are able to block efforts to mobilize these resources into these conflicts, it becomes problematic. The other thing that's becoming very problematic with UN peacekeeping is the role that China is increasingly playing in UN peacekeeping. They are now the largest troop contributing country among the P5, the permanent 5 veto-wielding members of the UN Security Council. They are insinuating themselves into peacekeeping missions all over the place, and then using those positions to advance their geopolitical goals and their economic goals. They're doing this in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in other places. And so it's something that we are not really doing very much about or really talking about a lot. And so I think that there are some flashing red lights there. I think, though, that peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, NATO peacekeeping, it keeps the burden off of the US in really important ways that most of us don't, acknowledge or talk about. So I think the answer is sometimes, yeah, sometimes, half and half.
Well, I think another theme that I'm starting to hear is that we live in a new world post the end of the Cold War, and I think now we're post the 9/11 era. And a lot of our thinking about America's role in the world is evolving, and many of our old institutions aren't working. And so, George, is there a rethinking that also needs to be done if we want this realism rebate, so to speak. Great phrase, you should copyright it. Should we also be rethinking the ways in which we get allies to help us and to help themselves? And I'll just throw the Quad out there, which is something that we were involved in, where we used this grouping of nations, kind of an ad hoc grouping. There's no headquarters of the Quad. The foreign ministers and the intelligence chiefs get together and they cooperate because we have shared interests. Is that something that should be maybe explored a little more? A rethinking of these things and how we operate with friends and allies?
Yes, I think that that's crucial. And I want to give you one small example and one big example. I'll start with the one big example, which has to do, I think, in general about thinking about how these institutions operate, right? That there are actually a wide variety of international organizations and types of interface. And so one that I'd like to highlight that people don't talk about often is the Five Eyes, right? These are the 5 English-speaking countries of the world, the United States, Canada, of course, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, so on. So they meet and they share intelligence. And guess what? There is no secretariat. There is no massive billion-dollar building and so on and so forth. They hold conferences and meetings, but they share a kind of combined sense that they view the world similarly in some ways and that they have certain interests that overlap. And they're going to protect those interests by engaging in a robust but not overly bureaucratic method of collaboration, right? And so maybe other institutions should be trimmed back to take that form, to deal with these sort of surging new realities that not just kind of the ambitions of people like President Putin, but also technology are presenting. Even if we could adapt the United Nations in an effective way, could we adapt it at the rate it is necessary to deal with cybersecurity? I don't know, but I think that it takes more than simply dedication to reform. Now, let me give you that small example I've been talking about. One of the places that I did research when I was in graduate school was in Kosovo, where I was a Fulbright scholar. And by dint of my placement there, I advised the Kosovar government on its relationship with international institutions. And I was astonished that nearly a decade after Kosovo had gained independence, the United Nations mission in Kosovo, which had been created to kind of create a space for these people to have some autonomy after these terrible genocidal acts by Serbia, that this wasn't fading away. In fact, it was getting bigger. Yeah. Right? And so I looked into this, and what was happening was that every time the Security Council would consider the fate of UNMIK, the United Nations mission in Kosovo, Russia would intervene and they'd say, no, this mission can't go away, and they would veto. And there you see the perversity of how certain international institutions work, because Russia's aim is to cast doubt on the legitimacy of Kosovo's independence.
Yeah, and they block them from joining the UN every time they try.
And so this is what I think folks like and the ambassador and I are concerned about when we say that international institutions have sometimes fallen victim to these kind of spirals of bureaucratic unwork, that they sometimes spin gold into paper. That this is not necessarily the kind of usage that we hope they would get out of them. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's a fascinating answer, and it's just I don't know. I'm kind of a cynic, so I tend to think that you can't really reform these things. You just have to completely destroy them and build up new things, because I think our mantra was, do these institutions, do they hew to their missions, and do they serve the interests of the member states that created them? And the answer was always no. So
what's the value proposition?
And what's the value proposition?
What are we getting from this? And this was something Nikki Haley, every day, it was like the question at the top of the hour every single day. What is our value proposition here? What is this institution delivering for the United States in terms of what we put into it? What do we get out of it? And if it was in a deficit position, she's like, then either we need to try to fix it, and if it can't be fixed, then we need to go. That's how we were about the Human Rights Council. That was how we were about the refugee agency that's special for the Palestinians, where they get their own special little refugee agency at the UN that is one of the most corrupt and venal organizations within a very corrupt and venal organizational infrastructure. And so, really asking those hard questions. And it pissed people off. People got really angry that we were doing this, including many of our close allies. But at the end of the day, we're like, look, we can't, these are U.S. taxpayer dollars that we're spending here. I can't, with a straight face, go back to the American people and justify sending money to UNRWA to promote anti-Semitism. How can we justify that? That's unjustifiable. So you tell me what the answer is. You tell me, because we're not going to do it anymore. And we got so much grief for it, but she was like, I don't care. This is what we're doing.
Oh, it makes me so happy to know that there's somebody like Ambassador Haley within the bowels of the United Nations. I don't know if they're having those conversations today, but
they are not.
I just want to go back to the core theme of the panel and see if we can wrap some of these arguments together. The theme of the panel is why isolationism is the wrong strategy for these perilous times. And it's true that we've now heard arguments that we are deeply interconnected in ways that will be hard to unlink, and maybe that we shouldn't unlink, whether it be military ties or economic ties. But let's presume that actually President Trump was right, and we were overextended. And you know what? Allies did have to do more, and we weren't exerting U.S. power enough in the world. Ambassador Currie, maybe I'll throw this to you. We've got about 5 minutes left. If that's true, then what do we need to do? Will any of these changes be made without the heavy hand of U.S. coercion and U.S. leadership, given your experience in negotiating and dealing with these other nations?
Well, I think, when you work in a bureaucracy, you really come to know the old saying that nobody likes change except a wet baby. And I think that we really, anytime we tried to change anything, there was so much institutional resistance, both whether within our own government or within the UN or you name it. And so I think that we have to change. It's either change or die in this situation. I think that has got to start being communicated to the American people in ways that they can understand and accept. And it's also got to be communicated to our elites and the people who populate these institutions that, look, you've either got to get with the program and start making these changes, or we are going to be, decline is a choice. I believe that. And our enemies think we are in terminal decline. I want to be very clear about that. And we have real enemies who really hate us and want to see us destroyed. China, Russia, Iran. These are countries that want to destroy this country and see it weak and dependent and declined and in a place where we don't want to be. And the things that we take for granted in our daily lives, they will be gone. The security that we take for granted, the prosperity that we take for granted, the freedom that we take for granted, they will be threatened. So it's either change or die. And I think, here in the American West, you all know that. This is not an alien concept for people here. But in Washington, D.C., these people, they are all about perpetuating the status quo. And it is really, really hard. But at a certain point, it is existential. And I think we have reached that point.
So, George, is this recalibration that, let's be honest, President Trump started the conversation.
Yes.
A very necessary conversation. Is this recalibration good for us? How far along are we? What has this administration done to swing us back in maybe a direction away from promoting democracy everywhere? Where are we on the pendulum? Give us some final thoughts.
I think these are incredibly turbulent times, and that although I deeply disagree with the Biden administration on many points, I think that they came in wanting to provoke change. You see this with regard to their Summit for Democracy.
Really? You believe that?
I wish it were a summit for Democrats in the sense that, you had actual activists rather than excluding governments that are borderline democracies or believe they're democracies. I think this created a lot of turbulence. But I have to say that there's a tendency to suggest that those who want the United States to have a more realistic view of the world, that they are kind of morally bankrupt. And so what I would say that is, in order for this debate to move forward, in order for us to see clearly, to talk about consequences, we have to recognize that those who are advocating for, what you might call a realism rebate, are sitting with a deep moral conviction, and that is expressed by people like John Quincy Adams, who asked provocatively in Congress, what good does it profit the United States to gain the whole world and to lose our soul? And those are the stakes that people feel. And so it is not simply one of engaging in moral action on behalf of persecuted people all over the world. It's also a debate about ourselves. And so that's what I hope unfolds in public, but we'll certainly wait to see.
Well, it's certainly an issue in the election. Who would have thought that we'd have an election where foreign policy was one of the major issues? Ambassador Currie, we've got a minute 15 left. Any final thoughts for us?
Just that, I am optimistic because, as Elaine said, we're America. We've been in this situation before. We've faced these kinds of existential threats before. We can do this, but we've got to get our confidence back as a country, and we've got to start believing in ourselves that we can build things, that we can do big things, and that we are still that shining city on the hill.
And that American power is good for the world, not
and
bad.
And that we are a good country, that we deserve prosperity and freedom, and that we deserve those things, and that the self-loathing has got to stop. It's got to stop.
Well, maybe we'll leave it there. If you could all join me in thanking Ambassador Currie, Dr. Bogden, for their comments, their insights. Thank you very, very much.